linoleic acid, which is really the fat that we're pointing a finger at in this story, it is everywhere in animal fats, so there's no avoiding it. Of course, we're eating, orders of magnitude, I think 56,000% more now than we were 100 years ago. When we're getting it from refined foods and just straight kind of cooking oil, versions of soybean oil and canola oil, etc., we are not only getting way too much, of course, but even if we were getting more modest amounts, we're not getting it the way nature intended. When we eat linoleic acid from animal sources, it always comes with antioxidant vitamins, like, say, vitamin E. I think there's something kind of genius about this, where if you can get linoleic acid and keep it as linoleic acid, the body knows what to do with that. And in fact, Stephen Cunnane, who we often invoke in the low-carb realm because of his incredible work on ketones and Alzheimer's disease, found years ago that linoleic acid and the seed omega-3 alpha-linolenic acid are the highest burned fats in the brain for energy, and it makes them actually ketogenic. The brain makes its own ketones from these polyunsaturated fats, linoleic acid and alpha-linolenic acid. But it stayed as linoleic acid. In other words, it didn't turn into a lipid peroxide. And maybe that's because it had antioxidants to keep it clean. It helped maintain the integrity of that fatty acid. In contrast, when we're eating it from a refined source, not only are we eating too much, but let's put volume or consumption amount to the side, but we've robbed away the natural, perhaps, antioxidant mechanisms that would have allowed the cells of the body to just use the fat in its pure form. We've changed it now into a lipid peroxide. And that, to me, is the real heart of the matter. And where I cannot deny that linoleic acid has a problem beyond its caloric value, where they would say, now, it's soybean oil isn't really a problem beyond the fact that we just eat too much. I can nod my head to that a bit and acknowledge, yeah, we definitely eat too much. But I can't overlook the fact that it truly is the most readily oxidized, turning into a lipid peroxide of the lesser saturated or more saturated fats. This becomes a lipid peroxide very, very readily. And lipid peroxides are remarkably damaging or pathogenic molecules, where we know that these lipid peroxide metabolites from linoleic acid force a fat cell to grow through hypertrophy. It limits the potential for hyperplasia. And so if you have fat cells that are being told to grow because there's sufficient energy and sufficient insulin, you have to have both of those. If there's ample linoleic acid in its peroxide metabolites, it's forcing that growth to happen through hypertrophy, and that is a sick way to get fat. We are literally doing studies in my lab now looking at some of these linoleic acid metabolites and how they change mitochondrial function in muscle cells and fat cells. And it is not good. It is something that goes beyond the saturation of the fat and just the pure amount of calorie. I think too many people misunderstand the relationship of linoleic acid to inflammation. What they do know is that linoleic acid can be converted into arachidonic acid. And then arachidonic acid can be converted into pro-inflammatory and pro-clotting molecules like prostaglandins and thromboxanes. And so because that pathway exists, they assume that linoleic acid is pushing that pathway forward. And that doesn't happen. Linoleic acid is converted to arachidonic acid by nature of regulatory enzymes. And it's a need-based system. So we're breaking down linoleic acid into these potential pro-inflammatory metabolites as the cell may need them. And the cell does need them. These are molecules that are essential to survival. Inflammation, of course, is essential to recovery and healing and immunity. I don't think this is a system we can push forward with more linoleic acid. Because remember, linoleic acid has alternative fates, including just simply being burned for energy, which mitochondria do perfectly well. Whether it goes into arachidonic acid and then so on or further depends on the need and the activation of those regulatory enzymes to actually pull that process along. If linoleic acid is in fact promoting inflammation, and it very well could, I would say it's likely because of its conversion into lipid peroxides. And we know that macrophages will very hungrily engulf lipid peroxides, immediately sensing this peroxide as a harmful pathogenic molecule, and then doing its job, it will engulf them, and then it will become a foam cell. As it has engulfed too much, this lipid peroxide will start to activate. The macrophage is essentially saying, hey, there's too much of this, I need help. And that is inflammation. It's when one immune cell starts to call out for help from other immune cells, and now we have systemic inflammation. So if linoleic acid is driving inflammation, it's because of it having been converted into a lipid peroxide. The macrophage, without a doubt, engulfs that, and that would then in turn stimulate inflammation throughout the body. So I don't think it's a direct effect. I think if you remove the immune cell, the phagocyte, eating that lipid peroxide, I don't think there is inflammation.
I fall into this trap too, speaking of oxidation and inflammation as if they're one and the same, which they're not. They're completely not, but sometimes we get lazy and talk about them as one thing.